Hey y'all, so thank you for tuning in today. We have Jim Butcher's Small Favor. We're on the scary chapter of chapter 30. If you recall last time, Dresden just kind of figured out that they are, the parlay was to get Ivy, not to, to parlay or not even to get Marcone or anything like that. But Nicodemus was playing quite a few steps into the future instead of just the steps going on here. It's kind of an interesting little thing. We'll have to see what's going on and how these things are going to work out. Anyway, if you guys would go ahead and like, subscribe, and share, and also then go pick up your copy of the book, and also take a look. We are getting to here towards the end of this book. So if you guys don't have chapter 11, that would be great. Let me go ahead and I will get chapter 11. Sorry about that. Book 11. We will go ahead and get started on chapter 30. My brain flew along a lot faster than my feet. Given the heavy snow outside, the first line of retreat the archive would take would be into the Never Never. The spirit world touches on the mortal world at all places and at all times. It gets weird once you realize that totally alien regions of the Never Never might touch upon reality close points in the real world. Crossing into the Never Never is dangerous unless you know exactly where you're going. I don't use it as a fallback very often at all. But if you've really got your back to the wall, and you have more experience than I do at crossing over, you can get a feel for the crossing and almost always get the same place, relatively benign. I figured it was safe to assume that the archive would be savvy enough to feel comfortable stepping over. In fact, she would have chosen this location for the parley for precisely that reason. The Denarians would know it, too, and they didn't want the archive to escape their ambush and come back loaded for bear. They would have prepared countermeasures, as they had from Marcone. No, scratch that. Exactly the way they had from Marcone, I realized. The huge spell that had been used to tear apart the defenses of the Crime Lord's panic room hadn't simply been a way for the Denarians to secure the bait in the scene. It had been a field test for their means to cut off the magical energy from the area, and access to the Never Never with it, and to imprison something big at the same time. It was a bear trap, custom designed for Ivy. They were going to spring that monstrous pentagram again. Only this time I was going to be standing inside it when it happened. Fortunately, the shed was a lot squattier and more stable than Marcone's old apartment building had been. Though that didn't mean big pieces enough to kill people wouldn't fall when the beam ripped through the walls. And though a lot of stonework was used, there was still the danger of fire. Fire in an aquarium. Breathe in the irony. But more important, once that pentagram came up, and it was coming now, I could feel it, a faint stirring of power that slid along the edges of my wizard senses like some huge and hungry snake passing by in darkness. It was going to shut the building off from the rest of the world, magically speaking. That meant that I wasn't going to be able to draw in any power to use to defend myself, any more than I'd be able to breathe if someone plunged my head underwater. Usually, when you work a spell, you reach out into the environment around you and pull in energy. It flows in from everywhere, from the fabric of life in the whole planet. You don't create a hole in the field of energy we call magic. It pours in together, levels out instantly, all across the world. But the circle about to go up was going to change that. The relatively tiny area inside the shed would contain only so much energy. Granted, it would be a fairly rich spot. There was a lot of life in the building, and it was hosted a lot of visitors, generating a lot of emotions, especially the energy given off by all those children. But even so, it was a sealed box. And given the number of people present who knew how to use magic, the local supply wasn't going to last long. Try to imagine a knife fight in an airtight phone booth. Lots of heavy breathing and exertion, but not for long. One way or another, not for long. That was their plan, of course. Without magic to draw upon, it was pretty much just a scrappy guy with a gun, whereas Nicodemus was still a nigh invincible engine of destruction. For a few seconds, my steps slowed. Put it that way, it almost sounded a little crazy of me to be rushing into this. I mean, I was basically opting for a cage match with a collection of demons, and one that I would have to win within a matter of seconds or not at all. And I hadn't been all that impressive against the Denarians when I'd had relatively few constraints on what power I could wield against them. I did some mental math. If the symbol the Denarians were using was approximately the same size as the one at Marcone's place, it would be big enough to encompass only the Oceanarium itself and the pentagram at its center. Murphy and the others, if they stayed where we'd come in, would probably be safe. More to the point, if they'd stayed where they were, they would have no way to enter the Oceanarium. That meant that it would just be me, Ivy, and maybe Kincaid against Nicodemus, Tessa, and every Denarian they could beg, borrow, or steal. Those were long odds. Really, really long odds. Ridiculously long odds, really. When you have to measure them in astronomical units, it probably isn't a good bet. So, going in there would be bad. If I didn't go in, though, it would just be Ivy and Kincaid against them all. In a deadly business. Kincaid was one of the deadliest, at the top of the field for centuries. But there was only one of him. Ivy had vast knowledge to draw upon, of course, but once she'd been cut off and expended whatever magic she had immediately available to her, the only thing she'd be able to do with all that knowledge would be to calculate her worsening odds of escape. Every hair on my body tried to stand up all at the same time, and I knew that the symbol was being energized. In seconds, it would howl to life. I guess in the end, it came down to a single question. Whether or not I was the kind of man who walks away when he knows a little kid is in danger. I'd been down this road before. Not going in there would be worse. Heat shimmers filled the air in the hall in front of me as I sprinted toward the Oceanarium. Fight smarter, not harder, Harry. I drew in power on the way. A lot of power. If there wasn't going to be any magic available for the taking once the symbol went up, I'd just have to bring in my own. Usually, I draw in power only when it's ready to flow directly out of me again, channeling the energy through my mind and into a structure of a spell. This time, I brought it in without ever letting it out and built it up as a pressure behind my eyes. My body temperature jumped by at least 4 or 5 degrees, and my muscles and bones screamed with pain while my vision went red and flickered with spots of black. Static electricity crackled with every single motion of my limbs, bright green and painfully sharp, until it sounded like I was running across the field of bubble wrap. My head pounded like every New Year's hangover I'd ever had, all in the same spot. And my lungs felt like the air had turned to acid. I concentrated on keeping my feet underneath me and moving, one step at a time. I pounded through the entry to the Oceanarium, felt a shivering sensation as I ran right through a veil I had not sensed was there, and all but barreled into a demonic figure crouched down on the floor. I skidded to a stop, and there was an instant of surprise as we stared at each other. The Denarian was basically humanoid, as most of them were, a gaunt, even skeletal gray-skinned figure, spurs of bone out from every joint, slightly curved and wickedly pointed. Greasy, Lanky hair hung from its knobby skull to its skinny shoulders, and its two pairs of eyes, one very human brown and one glowing demonic green, were both wide and staring in shock. It was crouched amidst the preparations of a spell of some kind. A candle, a chalk circle on the floor, a cup made from a skull and filled with water. And it wore a heavy canvas messenger bag slung across one shoulder. One hand was still down in the bag, as if it had been in the midst of drawing something out when I'd come charging up. Fortunately for me, my mind had been in motion. His had been tangled up in whatever spell he was doing, and he was slower to get back into gear than I was. So I kicked him in the face. He went down with a grunt, and a chip of broken tooth skidded across the floor. I didn't know what spell he was getting together, but it seemed a good bet that I didn't want him to finish it. I broke his circle with my will as I crossed it with my body, unleashing a ripple of random and diffused energies that had never had the chance to coalesce into something more coherent. I knocked his skull goblet into one of the enormous nearby tanks with my staff as I raised it and pointed one end of the stunned Denarian, snarling, "Fusare!" Some of that searing storm of power I was holding in screamed out of my body and down through my staff, hurtling at the Denarian. An invisible cannonball surrounded by a cold of static discharge. It was more power than I'd meant to unleash. If it hit him, it was going to blow him halfway across Lake Michigan. But while the Denarian's mortal set of eyes may have still been blank with shock and surprise, the glowing green set was bright with rage. The thorny Denarian lifted his left hand with a sweeping gesture, made a rippling motion of his fingers, drawing his hand towards his mouth, and he just ate my spell. He ate it. And then that gaunt, skeletal face spread in a toothy smile. "That," I muttered, "is incredibly unfair." I lifted my left hand just as the Denarian crouched and vomited out a spinning cloud of black threads that came whirling through the air in dozens of tiny spiraling arcs. I brought up my shield, but none of the threads actually came down to touch me. They landed all around me instead, in a nearly perfect circle. And in an instant later, my shield stuttered and shorted out. I still had the energy for it. It hadn't been cut off. But somehow the Denarian's weird spell had disrupted the magic as it left my body. I tried to throw another bolt of force at him, and got to feel supremely silly waving my staff around to absolutely zero effect. "Interruptions," the Denarian said in an odd accent. "Always the interruptions." His left hand returned to rummaging in his bag, while his mortal eyes went back to the now scattered remnants of the spell, evidently dismissing my existence. The green eyes remained focused on me, though, and suddenly darkness gathered around his forefinger and his upraised right hand. Time slowed down. Dark light leapt toward me. Sheer defiance made me step forward, trying to brush past the little spinning columns of shadow that surrounded me, only to find them as solid as steel bars, and colder than a Yeti's fridge. I threw my magic against those bars to no avail as a shaft of dark lightning streaked toward my heart. Something happened. I don't know how to describe it. I was trying to slam another bolt of force between the bars of my conjured prison when something else got involved. Ever been carrying something and had someone intentionally, unexpectedly jostle your elbow? It felt something like that. A tiny bit critically timed nudge, just as I threw my will into the last futile effort of defiance. Power screamed as it wrenched its way out of my body. It shattered the black threaded bars of my prison and left a streak of metallic light on the air behind it for an instant, reflexive, like a trail of liquid chrome. It caught the failing Denarian in a massive silvery cyclorum of my own fist. I actually felt my fingers close over the gaunt, skeletal, gray-skinned figure, felt the numerous spurs of bone jetting from its joint press painfully into my flesh. I flung it away from me with a cry, and the huge silver hand flung the denarian into the nearest wall, ripping through several feet of expensive stone terrace and carefully simulated Pacific Northwest. I stared for a second, first at the stunned denarian and then at my own spread fingers, and at the floating silvery hand beyond mirroring my movements. Then the skeletal denarian gathered itself and rose, fast as hell, until I shoved the heel of my hand forward and drove his bony ass 6 inches into the wall of rock behind him. "Oh yeah, baby," I heard myself howl, elated. "Talk to the hand." I picked up the thorny fiend by a leg and laughed as I racked and bit and scrabbled at the construct that held it, and I could feel the pain of it. But it was a small thing, really. Something I might have gotten from a rat. Unpleasant as hell, but I'd felt much, much worse. And it was nothing compared to the agony of power still burning inside me. I slammed him into the wall again, then swung him 20 feet through the air, shoved him through a pane of unbroken 3-inch thick glass on the outer wall of the oceanarium, drew him back through and then rammed him through the next one, and the next one, and the one after that, cutting him into tatters as I did. I had maybe half a second's warning as my already overloaded nerves screamed that the circle was closing, that the sign was rising. As I felt the surge of energy approaching from no more than a dozen yards away, there was still no time for a shield. So Spin Boy would have to do. I flung him between me and where my instinct warned me the inbound power was coming from. And then there was a roar like a dozen turbine engines howling to life in synchronization. 30 feet from me, the walls exploded in light and hellfire. Heat, light, and sheer intangible power slammed against my senses and threw me from my feet. Bits of molten rock hissed through the air, deadlier than any bullet. Spiny Boy caught a bunch of those. They flew out of his back and left gaping, smoking, cauterized holes in it. I could see them through the silvery haze of the construct hand that still held him. I could feel the heart as they bored through the construct, and then my head bumped the ground hard enough to make me see stars. I rolled to my feet and nearly wobbled over the railing and into the pool with the whales. I slammed the end of my staff into the ground with my left hand and leaned heavily against it, panting. I was still alive. I still retained an agonizing amount of energy. So far, I thought woozily, everything was going exactly according to plan. I was still alive. The skeletal, spiny denarian lay twitching on the ground 10 or 12 feet in front of me. There were big, smoking holes in its bodies. One of its arms was moving, so was its head, but its legs and lower body were completely limp. I could see the bones of the spine standing out sharply from its gaunt, emaciated back. 2 of the smoking holes intersected that spine precisely. He, or she, I supposed if that mattered, wasn't going anywhere. Great currents of energy, 8 or 9 feet thick, intersected maybe 50 feet away. It was like looking at the cross-section of a river in flood. If the river had been made of fire instead of water, and if 2 rivers could have intersected and passed through each other without affecting each other's courses. I turned my head and saw, through the walls of glass that I'd broken, more of the same beams, all around the oceanarium and the unbroken wall. The eerie part was that the fiery current of energy was silent. Absolutely silent. There was no crackle of flame, no roar of superheated air, no hiss of steam as snow and ice melted. I heard some rubble falling, stone landing on stone. I heard a broken electrical line somewhere spitting and snapping for a few seconds before it, too, went silent. That was when I realized a couple of things. The silver energy construct that had gripped the denarian was gone, and I couldn't feel my right hand. I looked down in panic, but found that it was still there, at least, flopping loosely at the end of my arm. I couldn't feel anything below my wrist. My fingers were slightly curled and didn't respond when I told them to move. Crap, I muttered. Then I gathered my wrists about me, gripped my staff more firmly in my left hand, and took several rapid steps until I stood over Spiny Boy. Then I bashed him over the head with a solid length of oak until he stopped moving. Immobilized wasn't the same as unconscious. He wouldn't be the only one of his kind in the building, and I didn't want him shouting my location to anybody the second my back was turned. One down. Who knew how many to go? I crouched in the walkway with the wall on my right, the windows facing the outside of the oceanarium on my left, and the beam of hellfire at my back. It was the most secure position I was likely to get. There was still no sound, which meant that they hadn't tried to take the archive yet. Kincaid would not go down quietly. But they were in here with me. They had to be. But they didn't necessarily know I was in here with them. That could be an advantage. Maybe even a huge advantage. Sure, Harry. What cat ever expects the mouse to come after it? I stuffed my numb right hand in my duster pocket, tried to ignore the bone-deep ache of unspent power racking my body and the limb-weakening tremors of raw terror radiating through my guts, and stalked silently forward to sucker punch some fallen angels. Whew. Hope everything turns out all right. Yikes. Anyway, thank you guys so very much for listening to Chapter 30 of the Dresden Files. Do stay tuned for Chapter 31. And like I said, we're getting close to the end, so you guys might want to go ahead and order Book 11. Again, thank you guys so very much for tuning in, and you have a wonderful and blessed day.